Well, in the nearly 1 year that Raul Castro has been president of Cuba, he has unfolded a series of modest, and I would say modestly paced reforms that have been aimed at basic bread and butter issues for the Cuban people. Starting in the agricultural sector, he has begun to liberalize the production, distribution, and consumption of most kinds of food. He has begun to give title over to people working and living on the land so that they can start producing and selling their goods directly to Cuban consumers, and has also made accessible in basically stores the kinds of inputs, tools and fertilizer and other such things that farmers need in order to produce their goods. That's most important in terms of hitting the daily life issues for the Cuban people. In the year or so between the time of Fidel Castro's illness and the assumption of power formally by Raul, the Cuban government undertook sort of a massive pulse-taking, public opinion gathering exercise. And one of the things that the Cuban people registered very, very heavily was their anger at some of the restrictions that have been imposed on them for years. Going to the tourist hotels had always been prohibited. Now Cubans who have the money to pay can go to any of the hotels that foreign visitors go to. Same in terms of access to cell phones. Cubans can now buy cell phones. Of course, the question of who has money to buy cell phones or go to hotels is a secondary issue, but there was a sense that those rights needed to be addressed, and he did so, and I think that that has changed perceptions of what kind of space is available for Cubans. The third reform that is anticipated is eliminating the requirement for Cubans to have permission to travel abroad. That's another area in which the basic rights of Cubans had been directly impinged upon, and which it is understood to be near changing. Raul Castro has often sounded in his speeches, which are much more brief than those of Fidel, a bit like Margaret Thatcher, emphasizing productivity, efficiency, the possibility that markets can actually deliver where the state cannot. He talks about obviously framing the revolution as dependent upon the continuation of socialism, but he also now talks about the need for Cubans to be productive, and for Cubans that don't work, the unfairness of Cubans who don't work depending upon Cubans that do work. He's also, in that line, eliminated the limitations on wages so that now income can be attached to productivity and people are no longer constrained by limits on wages. The sense that he is trying to convey is that the state simply can't afford to pay for everything anymore, and that the productive Cuban worker that is obvious to anybody that goes to Cuba in terms of the level of talent and training and education really does need to be unleashed. And he has exhibited much less of an allergy to the market than his brother. I really think that looking abroad for other models is going to lead us nowhere, because in Cuba I think what is unfolding is a hybrid. It can't be China because China is just way too big politically, and of course political control is still key. Politically, the Cuban government, as currently constructed, cannot afford to just open up the economy the way China has. It perceives itself as still under threat by the United States, and is a tiny island. And the commitment to the revolution and to sustaining the legacy of the revolution will mean looking around and probably cobbling together different approaches. The social democracies of Scandinavia, I know, are looked at probably by many reformers and economists on the island much more so than China. Likewise, Vietnam, which some people also toss around as a model where the party has kept control but the economy has opened totally. That economy is 10 times the size, and its population 10 times the size of Cuba, so there the analogy doesn't really draw. What has happened in the last 10 years is that, and that therefore means under Fidel and continuing with Raul, in the last 10 years, the Cuban government has seen itself as having many other options beyond the United States, but such as Brazil, such as Venezuela, such as Russia, such as the European Union, such as Canada. The United States, however, of course, is a very important market, a source of investment. More than 10% of the Cuban population live in the United States, continue to come here, to go back and forth. So clearly, the kind of unnatural state of affairs between the United States and Cuba needs to change. I think that is recognized in Cuba, recognized in the United States as well. But the reform process in Cuba is going to go at its own pace, and Raul Castro will not frame it as a search for a way to engage the United States. The Cuban government will not be seen as explicitly making any concessions in terms of its reforms on the economic front or the political front in order to get access to the U.S. market, because it's not its priority any longer. Having said that, there's a lot of trade and exchange on the cultural level, diplomatic level, in terms of basic security interests that both countries have that do merit deeper engagement. Well, we do have a law called the Helms-Burton Law, which does require that the Cuban regime pretty much commit political suicide, that the Castro brothers are all gone. It really requires de-Baathification, if you will, purging of the Communist Party, purging of the Castro supporters in all of Cuba's institutions, a democratic election, release of political prisoners, a free press, a Jeffersonian democracy before the United States will lift the embargo. But it does not prohibit engagement in terms of allowing exchanges between Cuban and Americans at the university and cultural level, sports. We've had all of that in the late 1990s when Pope John Paul's visit began a process of opening that the Clinton administration pursued, that the Castro government pursued. But the law, as Congress has written it, does make it pretty difficult for a full-blown lifting of the embargo unless Congress either repeals Helms-Burton or bit by bit chips away with it. And I think we will see that bit by bit chipping away in this year. Well, Russia is resurgent, not just in Latin America, but obviously much nearer to Russia's own borders. I do, however, think that Russia recognizes the limitations of its capabilities in the Western Hemisphere, and I really think it has been vastly overblown to suggest anything like a kind of military security relationship that Moscow and Havana had during the Cold War. A lot has been made by Fidel Castro himself, by Raul Castro, but especially by Fidel and by Hugo Chavez, that the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela is carrying out what the Cuban Revolution began. But I think most Latin Americans and most observers abroad see the comparison as pretty fatuous. I mean, it has benefited both Venezuela and Cuba in the last few years to represent themselves as having an ever-deepening alliance, and surely Venezuela's economic and oil support for Cuba has been very important over the last few years. Likewise, Cuba's political advice to Chavez over how to institutionalize and his revolution has been enormously important to consolidating power for Chavez. But having said that, I think there's really only going to be one Cuban revolution ever. As we know, although he rails against neoliberalism and globalization, Chavez depends on the world economy fundamentally for his survival because of his reliance on oil. So I would take this as kind of ideological and rhetorical simpatico, but I would never say that what's happening in Venezuela is reproducing the Cuban Revolution. Well, you know, even before Fidel got sick, there had already been a transition of a second and third generation of Cubans running the country at the municipal and provincial and national level, on the economy, politics, the bureaucracy, you name it. Fidel had already brought in young people and trained them, not only personally, but personally too. When Raúl came in, he represented, of course, continuity, but what we have seen under Raúl is, again, sort of generations of people in their 30s and 40s and 50s who really are managing the country. When Raúl Castro, perhaps after his 5-year term that he's in the middle of serving right now, is no longer president, however that should transpire, I think we'll see a further continuity of the individuals now around Raúl. We might see a younger generation begin to come into the Council of State, to the Politburo. Already the Communist Party and the National Assembly are populated by substantially younger people than they have been in the past. So I don't anticipate an abrupt rupture with what we've seen over the last 50 years, even when Raúl is gone. America's policy toward Cuba is driven 98% today by domestic politics, by the influence of Cuban American voters and Cuban American financial contributions to both political parties. Historically, the Cuban American community's view has been to keep a hard line in terms of keeping the embargo in place and diplomatically isolating this Castro and the previous Castro regime. Today, what we're seeing is an evolution of Cuban American opinion in which the older generation, as in Havana, is either dying off or retreating from the political scene. And we have a new generation in both parties that are asserting that Cuba cannot be the only issue that Cuban American citizens care about and isn't the only issue. So we see that Cuban Americans are no longer single issue voters. Cuban American voters, whom historically have been largely Republican, are disaffected now with the Republican Party and are voting as independents, crossing over, voting for Democrats, and voting on issues beyond the Cuba issue. But specific to the Cuba issue, we have a recognition in the majority of Cuban Americans that current policy, that is, of isolation and embargo, has failed. This doesn't mean they're anti-Castro, but there is a desire to be able to see and support their own family members on the island and to be involved in and have a stake in Cuba's future. Now that will continue to be a factor affecting U.S. policy toward Cuba, but I think there's a recognition that the sidelining of Fidel Castro, even though his brother represents continuity, is an opportunity to bury the hatchet, and I think policies will begin to reflect that slowly over the next several years.